meeting number 14 of the Standing Committee on International Trade, pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, September 18, 2025. The committee is commencing its study of Canadian supply chains, forced labor, and related imports. We have with us today Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Stuart True, Senior Researcher. From the Canadian Labour Congress, Elizabeth Kwan, Senior Researcher. Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability, Aldine Gilchrist-Blackwood, Network Coordinator.
Il n'y a pas d'interprétation, Madame la Présidente. L'interprète a même souligné qu'il y avait un problème de son, en fait.
I'm sorry, I'm not...
Attends dans mon oreillette.
Juste, mais je pense, Monsieur l'interprète qui a dit ça, qu'est-ce qu'il y avait, en fait, juste à être certain.
What's the problem? Did not have translation? Minutes until we get this corrected.
Oui, j'essaie le microphone. Comment est-ce que ça fonctionne? Est-ce que vous pouvez m'entendre?
Vous pouvez changer de micro, peut-être avec un analyste. Attendez qu'ils interviennent quand même moins souvent. Je ne sais pas si...
Okay, resuming the meeting from the Canada-Tibet Committee. Sherab Therchin, Executive Director. Welcome to you all. Sorry for the delay. We will start with opening remarks and then proceed with a round of questions. You have up to 5 minutes each. Mr. True, I invite you to do your deputation for 5 minutes, please.
Well, thanks very much to the Chair and to the committee. It's a pleasure to be back here with you. I'll just say a few words about the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. We're a forward-looking research institute dedicated to the pursuit and defense of social, economic, and environmental justice. We advocate for policies that protect workers from corporate and state exploitation and hold companies accountable for their human rights, environmental, and other international legal obligations, to bring down the cost of living by increasing the labor share of national income and by expanding free and affordable public services. The CCPA therefore strongly supports measures to eliminate forced and child labor and the still too pervasive basic labor rights violations as well from domestic and international supply chains. We were pleased to see the Bloc Québécois introduce Bill C-251, amending the Customs Act and Customs Tariff in such a way that Canada may more vigorously uphold its legal obligations to block imports of goods from anywhere in the world, including North America, we hope, made in whole or part using forced or child labor. This is a vital piece of legislation required before the Canada Border Services Agency workers can begin to effectively screen and detain imports from entities, including countries, regions, or companies, on a future forced labor list. Quite simply, we need this or similar legislation to pass in order to meet our domestic legal obligations and our CUSMA obligations to our trading partners to stop forced labor goods entering the North American market. The fine details of the system would need to be hashed out in regulations to make sure CBSA officers have a clear idea of what and when to detain goods, but we can't get to that point without legislation allowing for that kind of guidance. So we strongly encourage this committee to push the government to pass C-251 or something similar as soon as possible. So a few small points on other elements of forced labor in Canadian supply chains. I think while it's good to see attention to the problem of forced labor, it's not the only or most pervasive type of human rights violation in Canadian supply chains or Canadian imports. Companies should have a duty to prevent violations of internationally protected human rights, including the right to organize, health and safety obligations, gender discrimination, environmental standards, and so on. This must be an enforceable legal obligation on firms within a comprehensive corporate due diligence regime. Second point I'll make is that we need to address forced labor in North America as well, right here in our backyard and in our country. We've seen a report out recently from the University of Toronto Human Rights Program talking about how much we bring into this country that was produced using prison labor in the United States, even though this has been illegal in Canada for over 100 years. There's prison labor in the auto sector, food, meat processing, fast food chains, and so on. Much of this is involuntary in prisons and poorly paid. We have example of large companies that operate in the U.S. and Canada. For example, Bumblebee, right, the seafood company, which is linked with Cloverleaf here in Canada, both owned by FCF, using forced labor on their fleets, bringing in tuna, for example, forced Indonesian labor on their boats, and those products ending up on North American shelves. We have union busting, at the Mercedes plant in Alabama, for example. That's currently going through the courts right now. There was a complaint from the union there in the United States. These are other things that we should be thinking about enforcing somehow, either through trade regime or through bans on force and other types of human rights violations in our supply chains. And of course, contemporary slavery in Canada's Temporary Foreign Workers Program. The third point I'll make, the final point, is that we need to coordinate on imports screening with Mexico and the United States. And there's an opportunity to do this in the upcoming review of the labor chapter in the CUSMA and, of course, of the agreement next year. As Above Ground points out in its submission to the Canadian government's consultation on the CUSMA review, the crisis of forced labor in global supply chains cannot be solved by one nation acting alone. Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, linked by deep trade flows under CUSMA, have an opportunity to improve their response to this crisis by better coordinating action to block goods made with forced labor from entering the marketplace in any access point. Canada is obligated to do this, right, by CUSMA Article 23.6. But as this committee has heard many times in past studies, the enforcement of this obligation is highly uneven between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. Since 2021, Canadian border agents have reportedly intercepted only 50 shipments of goods on suspicion that they were produced using forced labor, and only one single shipment was denied entry into Canada. While U.S. Customs and Border officials have stopped more than 7,000 shipments to this year alone, only 4 new withhold release orders were issued, and enforcement of the forced labor measures has become inconsistent and politicized. The goal should be to prevent forced labor, not punish countries that you don't like. Mexico's enforcement of the ban has also been even worse than Canada's. So on top of passing C-251 and getting on with the regulations to make it work, the CCPA further agrees with Above Ground that the current review of the CUSMA labor chapter and broader trade deal next year is an opportunity. As I was saying, it could include things like a shared definition of forced labor aligned with the ILO Conventions 29 on private use of forced labor and 105 on state use of forced labor. You could include intergovernmental information sharing about corporate supply chains and forced labor investigations, mutual recognition of enforcement actions to stop transshipments, right? Goods coming in from one country versus the other, more transparency with respect to investigations and enforcement, and more cooperation with labor unions, affected workers, and civil society groups, similar to procedures for submitting evidence of forced labor violations by importers and producers. So in conclusion, I'd say for too long, trade policy and international trade and investment agreements have provided strong enforceable rights to multinational corporations, but provide minimal guidance on adequate protections for the environment, for workers, and human rights. If, as the Prime Minister likes to say, this old model of free trade is dead, it is our obligation to build better, more sustainable trading and investment relationships that prioritize and enforce high standards of protection for workers and the environment. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. True. Ms. Kwan, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, committee members. It's an honor to be with you today. I just want to start with a little bit about the Canadian Labour Congress. The CLC represents over 3 million workers across Canada, including hundreds of thousands of workers in the public and private sectors engaged in trade activities. Canadian unions fight every day against labour exploitation, including forced labour, which is abhorrent. We have repeatedly called for the eradication of forced labour from the Canadian supply chains and to ensure that Canadian businesses operating abroad and at home do not contribute to labour and human rights abuses. Chair, I'd like to present the CLC recommendations on this matter. First, we ask the government to immediately introduce legislation to strengthen Canada's ban on imports of goods produced with forced labour that includes increasing Canadian importers' obligations to address forced labour in their supply chains. Second, the CLC would support robust oversight of Canada's new import ban regime to ensure effective compliance by importers with strong transparency and accountability measures. We would also call on the government to introduce legislation to create a new mandatory supply chain due diligence regime that requires governments and businesses to identify forced labor risks and to take actions to eradicate these risks. And lastly, we ask the government to ensure the meaningful and active engagement of the Canadian Labour Congress in the government's development and implementation of these measures. Chair, I'd like to elaborate on some of the reasons for our recommendations. Forced labor remains a pervasive issue in global supply chains. It is a critical issue that affects workers globally and has direct implications for Canadian labor standards, trade policy, and ethical business practices. The ILO estimates that over 28 million people are trapped in forced labor globally. Forced labor violates core labor rights in the ILO Declaration of Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. Workers in forced labor have little to no labor rights or social protections. They're abused and exploited and often face coercion and violence. Such gross exploitation of workers and their labor undermines fair wages, working conditions, and equal opportunities and treatment at work. Many, as Mr. True said, of these tainted goods end up in Canada. That is why forced labor in supply chains is an unfair trade practice and must be stamped out. All trade agreements should have strong, enforceable, and comprehensive labor chapters that include the elimination of forced labor. An effective ban of forced labor imports levels the playing field for more equitable and competitive trade while leveraging strong labor provisions for all workers covered by a trade agreement. The import of goods produced with forced labor is an important issue for Canada's relations with trade partners, especially the United States. The current CUSMA import ban, implemented under Canada's Custom Tariff Act, has proven to be weak and ineffective. Since 2020, when CUSMA came into force, Canada has denied one shipment of goods made with forced labor entering this country, while the U.S. has denied almost 10,000 shipments, and that's actually today's number. This large discrepancy has provoked the ire of some American politicians, including Senator Marco Rubio, as recently as September 2024 during the Biden administration. But, Chair, the current Trump administration also prioritizes the ban of goods made with forced labor in trade, as evidenced in the recent U.S. trade deals with Switzerland, Liechtenstein, El Salvador, Ecuador, Guatemala, Argentina, Malaysia, Cambodia, and Thailand. It is urgent that Canada act now and bring in a new effective ban on imports made with forced labor for the 2026 CUSMA renegotiation and in all our new trade agreements. An effective ban of forced labor imports will address the race to the bottom for labor standards, which in turn provides stability and resilience in the supply chains. Countries and businesses must be held accountable for using forced labor to trade unfairly. Fundamental labor and human rights are integral to fair and equitable trade. Thank you, Chair. I look forward to questions.
Mr. Vitt is ready. Thank you very much, Ms. Kwan. Mr. Gilchrist Blackwood, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the honorable members of this committee. Je tiens à vous remercier sincèrement de m'avoir
I would like
invité
to sincerely thank you for inviting me to join you this afternoon.
introducing the Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability. We were founded 20 years ago in 2005 and unite more than 40 organizations and unions from across Canada who are working to put in place measures to ensure Canadian companies respect human rights and labor rights throughout their supply chains around the world. Collectively, our members represent the voices of millions of Canadians. And our members come from diverse sectors of civil society, from human rights, environment, and international cooperation organizations, faith-based organizations, grassroots solidarity movements, and responsible investor groups. Our members also have long-standing relationships with partners around the world who have been adversely impacted by Canadian business activity. Et je tiens aussi à remercier le comité de se pencher sur cette question urgente.
I would like to start by thanking the committee for studying the important issue of human rights violations in Canadian supply chains. Canadians from coast to coast to coast continue to be deeply concerned about the numerous reports of abuses, including cases that have already been mentioned related to forced labor linked to the business activities of Canadian companies around the world. I would like to draw the attention of committee members to 3 points.
Intervention that Canadian supply chain legislation must put impacted workers and communities' needs first. So any legislation considered by this committee, including an import ban, must absolutely center rights holders. This requires close engagement with rights holders throughout the development and implementation of the policy. Of course, import bans have been identified as a valuable policy tool, a valuable tool by some rights holders, for instance, especially in contexts of state-based forced labor. There is also a risk that import bans could encourage lead firms in global supply chains to simply cut and run from suspected forced labor, which, if there are no effective safety nets in place, could leave workers without wages or guarantees they will find better work with a future employer. Thus, in the development of the regulations on an import ban, rights holders and civil society will need to be consulted in order to make sure these kinds of unintended consequences are avoided. My second intervention is that Canada needs an effective non-judicial mechanism to provide remedy for workers and communities facing harm in Canadian supply chains. However, currently Canada's non-judicial mechanism, the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise, or CORE, has yet to be granted the powers and independence it needs to do this important work. I want to highlight that a large portion of cases brought to the court to date have concerned allegations of forced labor in Canadian supply chains. And yet, since May 2025, the position of Ombudsperson has been left vacant, which harmfully leaves complainants in the dark. So I want to highlight again that Canada's approach to addressing forced labor in supply chains should include a clear commitment to staffing and empowering the Office of the CORE. And my final intervention that I'd like to make is that a part of its efforts to meaningfully address forced labor in Canadian supply chains, a key piece that Canada must adopt is comprehensive mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation. Import bans are a tool which address human rights abuse after harm has occurred, and if Parliament chooses to move forward with amendments to Canada's forced labor import ban, this should not be the only action taken. Our network would expect the government to make a firm and time-bound commitment to adopt comprehensive MHREDD, mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation, which can help proactively prevent forced labor and other serious human rights abuses in Canadian supply chains. There is a very clear consensus in Canadian civil society working with partners around the world that a law like this is necessary. And just briefly, MHREDD legislation does so by requiring companies engage with rights holders to take stock and take measures to prevent and remedy human rights abuses in their supply chains, all human rights abuses, which are interrelated and interdependent. And effective MHREDD legislation must also ensure effective remedy for impacted communities who are harmed by providing access to remedy in Canadian courts. This would help align Canada's policy approach with the expectations established in the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, as well as the OECD Guidelines for Responsible Business Conduct. And I'll just highlight that the UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, in his report on his 2023 country visit to Canada, recommended that Canada introduce mandatory human rights due diligence obligations on all Canadian companies. Tens of thousands of Canadians have called on our government to pass a law like this. Our network has developed model legislation, and I note as well that the government has previously recognized the need for due diligence measures to address human rights abuses in Canadian supply chains, including in the 2024 Fall Economic Statement. Alors, en conclusion, nous, le RCRCE, on recommande au gouvernement...
In conclusion, we recommend the government does 3 things. Take into account, above all, else affected communities and workers during the development of its legislation on supply chains. Finally, grant the Corps real powers and appoint a new ombudsman immediately. And 3, adopt comprehensive legislation on corporate due diligence. Thank you very much.
Mr. Turchin, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, committee members. I deeply appreciate this opportunity to speak with you today on the important matter of studying Canadian supply chains, forced labor, and related imports. I'm here today to share findings and perspectives to contribute in the support of Bill C-251. I would like to focus my presentation on the significant but often overlooked risk emerging from the Tibetan regions in China, where coercive labor practices, mass relocation, and environmentally destructive mining intersect with global supply chains that could reach Canadian consumers through electric vehicles, batteries, and other technologies. Given that Tibet hosts some of China's largest lithium reserves, which are essential to global EV production, there's a credible risk that Chinese manufactured EVs that could be imported into Canada may indirectly incorporate critical minerals extracted under conditions that violate international labor and human rights norms. Recent research, including the Turquoise Roof Bulletin, shows that majority of China's domestic lithium reserves are located on the Tibetan Plateau, which is around 3.6 million tons out of total 4 million tons reserves in China. Is located in historically Tibetan regions of Amdo and Kham. Chinese State Geological Service described this area as a vast ore belt, home to what they call as Asia's largest lithium deposit. These minerals feed the supply chains of BYD, CATL, and other major EV and battery manufacturers. As Canada considers importing low-cost Chinese EVs, the supply chains cannot be viewed in isolation. Tibet is geographically remote but economically central to China's green technology ambitions. In 2023, 6 UN special rapporteurs warned that China's so-called vocational training and labor transfer schemes in Tibetan region may constitute forced labor, noting that Tibetans cannot refuse participation or freely leave assigned jobs. Reuters revealed in 2020 that over 500,000 Tibetans, which is 15% of the region's entire population, were transferred into labor programs in the first 7 months of that year alone. Labor programs that included military-style training centers, ideological instructions, labor transfer quotas, relocation to factories, construction sites, and industrial zones. This system mirrors the structure of forced labor documented in East Turkestan and other high-risk regions. Displacement combined with the restricted mobility, political pressure creates a structural coercion. People who lose land and livelihood have no meaningful choice but to enter state-directed work. Lithium mining in Tibet is linked to severe environmental damage as well. Turkish Roof documents contaminated rivers from quote-unquote quick and dirty processing methods, dead fish and livestock downstream of mining operations, community protests met with force, detention, or disappearance, heavy militarization in mining areas, limiting community oversight. Environmental destruction leads to the loss of herding land, which is one of the main pillars of the Tibetan livelihoods. When herders can no longer survive from the land, they become vulnerable to state-directed labor placement, including mining. In this context, labor cannot be considered voluntary. Chinese EVs and the electric battery product entering the Canadian market may rely on lithium extracted from the Tibetan regions where communities are relocated by workers transferred through state-run training programs in areas where dissent is criminalized under conditions inconsistent with the ILO standards. Canada's forced labor ban, its public commitment to ethical sourcing, and its climate transition strategy require that Canada not inadvertently reward or subsidize abusive extraction regimes. I would like to share some recommendations. Require the Canada-Tibet Committee respectfully recommends the Standing Committee on International Trade advise the government to require full supply chain transparency for Chinese EVs and batteries entering Canada, adopt a mandatory human rights due diligence legislation. Companies must identify, mitigate, and remedy forced labor risk, apply a presumption of non-compliance for EVs with the untraceable mineral supply chains, coordinate with G7 partners, treat Tibet-sourced high-risk minerals similarly to conflict minerals, subject to shared exclusion framework. And finally, support independent monitoring of Tibet, fund satellite-based monitoring, open-source analysis, and civil society research to bridge the transparency gap created by Chinese state restrictions. Tibet today sits at the heart of China's critical mineral strategy. At the same time, this region is where forced labor risk, mass relocation, restrictive freedoms, and environmental destructive extraction converge. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I will now open the floor for questions. Mr. Mantle, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, gentlemen and lady, for your attendance and for providing testimony on this important topic. My first question will be to Mr. True and Mr. Gilchrist Blackwood, picking up on some comments you mentioned about the temporary foreign worker program in Canada. As you're aware, that's been a topic of discussion here in Parliament. I think the numbers are it's over 1.25 million temporary workers are now in Canada. And despite promises to address that, the numbers continue to rise. The promised cap was 82,000 this year. We're well over 100,000 now this year. So the problem seems to be getting worse, especially in the low wage stream, as it's called. And as you mentioned, there was a recent UN report on that. And to quote from that report, it referred to the temporary foreign worker program serving as, quote, a breeding ground for contemporary forms of slavery. In your considered view, would you view the TFW program in certain situations as tantamount to modern slavery?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, the results of the UN study suggested that. It's in certain cases, right? It's not across the board, but there are cases of very poor conditions of people's rights not being respected by the employer. And of course, the whole program, the flaw in the program is that there's no pathway to any kind of regularization here for these workers, right? They're completely vulnerable to the companies that bring them in, you know, and basically good behavior determines whether you come back next year or not, right? And there's no real formalized pathways to some kind of citizenship. So that's the kind of thing we would promote at the CCPA, is some kind of regularization, recognizing the essential work that these workers do in Canada and the value they create for the economy. They should be basically treated like other people who provide the same value to this Canadian economy. So.
And I'll maybe just name in my response. I absolutely agree that the UN report was, the Special Rapporteur's report was also very clear on this. I would direct to resources that are produced by CNC member organizations on this question who've worked on it more specifically. In the case of the CNC as a network, our focus as a network is on corporate human rights and environmental impacts outside of Canada more so, and so it's not this is an issue that CNC members have worked on individually, but absolutely, I think the report is clear, and I think I would echo a lot of what my colleague has shared in terms of the importance of pathways to regularization in particular.
Thank you. I want to turn now to the state of play with respect to enforcement. And I think there was great hope that the introduction of a ban on the importation of goods produced in whole or import by forced labor as part of the renegotiation of NAFTA would lead to some movement on this in Canada. The numbers certainly tell a different story. In the entire time, the rough numbers are about 50 shipments that have been introduced on suspicion. Part of the problem, if we get to it, is transparency. We just don't know because the CBSA doesn't tell us. In contrast to the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, which has a nice dashboard, which you can go and look and see how many shipments have been stopped, where they're coming from, what industries they represent, etc. Now, the government's marquee program in this area was something called the Supply Chains Act, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which was a transparency law which required companies and government entities of a certain size to prepare reports on their supply chains. That's now been enforced for we're entering the second round, I believe, of reporting. I wonder if you could tell me, to your knowledge, has that marquee legislation, the Supply Chains Act, resulted in any additional shipments being stopped at the border? And I'll open that to all of the witnesses.
For your question, in terms of the Supply Chain Act that you're referring to, which is the former C211, unions and other activists in Canada actually spoke very loudly against that piece of legislation because it is merely a transparency piece of legislation that does not compel anyone to act to address the risks, the forced labor risks that's identified in the supply chains. So, which is why I think that all of us here are calling for new legislation to come in to actually be able to be effective in this regard, in actually stopping the goods made from forced labor from entering Canada.
So, Ms. Kwan, just to clarify then, the Supply Chains Act, to your knowledge, has not resulted in any additional stoppage of goods produced by forced labor entering the Canadian market?
That's precisely the question. That piece of legislation was never designed to actually compel action to stop anything.
Pardon me, I'll perhaps just also in response to that question, and very much in agreement with my colleague, I think just underscoring that from the start, when Bill S211 was being discussed, there was a very clear and a very clear position from Canadian civil society highlighting that legislation requiring companies only submit reports just was not up to the task. And at the time we talked about it being frankly meaningless, and how in fact what is needed is comprehensive due diligence legislation that requires action. And so I do think that the evidence we've seen so far in the 2 years of the Supply Chains Act being enforced does really speak to that, and to that ongoing need for legislation that actually requires action to prevent abuses and not just to submit reports.
I realize I'm out of time. I don't know if the other two witnesses have a brief comment, yes or no. To your knowledge, has the Supply Chain Act resulted in any additional goods being stopped at the border?
No, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Fonseca, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. I'll actually follow along with some of the questions that Mr. Mantle was asking. So, and this will be to all the witnesses, and each of you can answer. So, what enforcement mechanisms, be it administrative penalties, import suspensions, should be considered for non-compliance with the proposed legislation? If you think that through, what would your answer be?
Thanks for the question. I would also, I think I would defer to Aiden for the specifics. They've done a lot of work on this, what the system would look like, and certainly in terms of due diligence, right? And that's different than the legislation that's before us, C-251, which would deal with simply import prohibitions. So CBSA would detain and confiscate and either destroy or send back, as I understand it, goods that were imported from areas where they were likely to be made using forced labor. So, that's my understanding of it. It wouldn't be an administrative penalty. It would simply be you're blacklisted as a region, as a company, or as a country, unless you can provide evidence otherwise that these products were not made with forced labor. We're going to detain them, and we're going to either destroy them or ship them back. Yeah.
Pardon me. I could maybe just chime in briefly on in the case of our due diligence legislation. I think a key piece for enforcement there is the private right of action. And again, this is it's a different piece of legislation that we're talking about now here, but our model legislation establishes a private right of action. for people who've experienced harm in the supply chains or operations of a Canadian company abroad in Canadian courts. And so that is a key piece there in the due diligence model.
So I would just maybe kind of say that the holistic response to forced labor is actually two pieces. One is the mandatory due diligence piece, and the other piece is the import ban piece. And if we had both pieces together, that would be great. But you know, if we want to basically separate the two and do them one by one, that's fine. But I urge you to consider actually a more comprehensive approach, just because if one comes in, it actually compels the other half to actually start kicking in terms of, you know, the necessity to actually act. So for instance, if you have a new or strengthened ban on forced labor imports, right? So you're stopping it, and as my colleague said, you know, that is kind of after the fact. The products have been produced by forced labor already, but they land at our borders, right? I would ask you to think about what that does to the businesses who are importing in Canada those goods, if that is to kick in. And the logical thinking would be, well, if you're going to stop the imports, then they might as well be able to actually address some of that ahead of time through, you know, legislation that is mandatory due diligence. So this is why I think that the best scenario, of course, is to have both parts be available at the same time, because that's a very comprehensive approach. So I would leave that there. And I would also like to say that, you know, C-251 is very important in terms of a model to look at the ban on forced labor goods, but to also think of it as not Canada going alone on this, because we're not, you know, starting this from scratch. There are other countries that have done this, that have studied a lot of this, and that they can actually be very informative. And in fact, the 2024 Fall Economic Statement did mention both parts, and there was legislation that would be introduced had that economic statement gone through and had been implemented.
Did you want to say anything? Yeah.
Yes. For the non-compliance in respect to Tibet, I think the challenge remains accessibility. I spoke on, of course, on the focused on lithium. But it's not just the lithium. Whether we talk about the forced labor or any human rights violation that's happening in Tibet, the challenge remains getting information out of Tibet. So, you know, I would request for combination of traceability, verification, sending an independent observer to Tibet, along with the consequences.
Just quickly to Ms. Kwan, you the Canadian Labour Congress, you represent 3 million workers here in Canada. So what sectors would be most exposed to this unfair competition? So goods that are made with forced child labor abroad?
I would say that any of the industries that import, for instance, autos. I think my colleague there has mentioned, you know, EVs, but it's more than that. You know, there are other things as well. I mean, it's very pervasive. Cotton, tomato, you know, bananas. You know, Ecuador.
No, right?
Tuna, right? So it is very pervasive, and I would say that it affects everyone, because, you know, one of the things that we don't really think about is what does this mean? It means cheap goods, but, you know, think back to the story of the Rust Belt in the United States. You know, they were promised cheap goods, right? And they didn't put in strong provisions to protect workers. And so what happens is that, it became part of the equation where, the industrial base got gutted out. So I think that it's very important. I know that it's not something obvious to most people, but it is very important to maintain those standards in our trading.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. On to Monsieur Savard Tremblay, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to thank our witnesses. Quick roundtable. Ms. Kwan, I agree with your perspective, the global perspective. During the last legislature, I sponsored C251 with Peter Julian. I voted for it, and I also voted against S211, along with my colleagues with the bloc. I want to talk about imports. I tabled C251. Mr. True was invited to the adoption of it. Are you in support of it?
C251? Yes.
Parfait, merci. Monsieur,
Thank you. Can you tell us your opinion on C251?
So for our network doesn't have, this is an issue where our network doesn't have a collective position. The network has a very clear collective position on a mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation. There are certainly member organizations who are very, very much in support of this bill and this approach. And I think I think in all cases there'd just be an important concern around seeing that in the regulations, the regulations would be built out with that rights holder centered approach. And so I think really highlighting that being an important piece, I think for all members of the network, that the regulations be developed with the real focus on rights holders.
Monsieur Terchin, vous étiez au point de presse, donc je sais.
Mr. Terchin, you were at the press conference. I know you support it, but just for the record, can you reiterate your position on C251?
Canada Tibet Committee is in support of Bill C251. Thank you.
Merci. Maintenant, Monsieur True, vous avez expliqué tout à l'heure comme.
Mr. True earlier explained how the Canadian model is not working, but how the American model works. What's the difference?
As far as I know, and I would encourage, I get my information as well from groups like CNCA and Above Ground. So as far as I know, and others might correct me on this panel, it just comes down to what they're allowed to do as border agents in the United States through regulations and legislation compared to what Canadian border agents are allowed to do. And so while we have this legislation in place that is supposed to bring us in line with the CUSMA commitments on banning forced imports, there's a lot of discretion, right, for our border services in order to how they go about doing that. And so what they need is a bit more guidance. And so the legislation, as I understand it, that you presented, which is one reason we support it, is because it would allow the government to start to provide that guidance for CBSA. But as my friend here was saying, how the regulations are developed and then how do we make sure the government actually moves forward with providing that guidance is also important. Because you can't just have new legislation that says the government is allowed to do something like providing guidance to border agents if the government's not going to provide the guidance, if you see what I mean. So we are, this would need some follow-up.
Je sais pas qui sera.
I don't know who can answer this. Maybe you, Ms. Kwan, when it comes to workers. A model that puts the burden on importers who have to demonstrate that they're not using forced labor. You're asking regions and business to do so. That model compared to the ineffective Canadian model that depends on the goodwill of the customs.
Répondre, j'ai supposé que vous
Any one of you can answer. I just assume you were the one who studied this.
I would say that the importers and exporters, basically the business, the value chain, the businesses in the value chain have to actually step up to look at their supply chains. Quite frankly, I think it was GM that recently there was an article that said that GM as a big company is asking their subsidiaries and their other companies to actually look at and try to actually address those risks. So, you know, it is something that large businesses, corporations, multinationals are doing. What we want to do is that we want to be able to compel action by more than just one or two companies, right? We want to actually get these companies to actually know that it is a good business model and that it is a sustainable business model.
Mais cela dit, actuellement, comme on le sait,
With that being said, and I just want to add more details to my question. Currently, it is up to the customs to decide. Mr. Xu said that almost nothing has been withheld. The American model works better. They seized billions of dollars worth of goods. So, if you support C251, then you believe that we should reverse the onus of proof.
Absolutely. I would say that, you know, if you're counting on one employee to stand up and say, I am going to do this, I am going to stop a whole shipment because, you know, I really believe this is for, I mean, it is a ridiculous burden to place on one employee, which is, you know, more or less what the current system is set up to do. I think that the system needs to actually be a system. It needs strong enforcement. It needs backup financial backing to it. And, you know, like I said, you know, it really, you know, if you're not one who actually has feelings about, you know, the issue of forced labor, you know, have feelings about the financial and trading aspects of forced labor, which is that we really need to get our act together so that we can go to the Kuzma table in 2026 and say, hey, we are doing this.
To Mr. Jenius.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to be back at this committee, and it's important that we're talking about forced labor again, even though it seems like I've been talking about this issue for a long time, and we haven't really seen any government action, at least not government action to meet the moment. A few of you talked in your opening testimony about lithium, about EVs, and I wanted to zero in on that point, and I think this is really important. So trade is obviously important for our economy, but it's also a tool for achieving other foreign policy objectives. And it seems clear to me that the government of China is making carefully considered strategic moves to dominate the emerging battery-driven sectors of our economy. Chinese companies are dominating extraction of key commodities in East Turkestan and Tibet, also in the DRC and in other parts of Africa. They're dominating manufacturing, and there's gross human rights abuses in every case, but this is also designed to leave us in the free world strategically dependent on the Chinese state after it has dominated supply chains and it controls our access to new technology. I'm very concerned about this. I think we need to sound the alarm about it, because if left unchecked, it will leave our societies deeply dependent, economically and politically vulnerable, and substantially unable to confront the kinds of human rights abuses that you've talked about. Therefore, in confronting the issue of forced labor, especially forced labor in these particular kinds of supply chains, we see a kind of convergence of our moral obligations, our economic interests, and our long-term strategic interests. Mr. Thurchin, it's good to see you. I wonder if you can share your thoughts on this issue of how, in some sectors, kind of overlapping with forced labor, we see these efforts at domination of certain supply chains and therefore creating structures of strategic dependency for us here in the free world.
So I chose to speak on lithium and its connection to Chinese EVs because although a lot of us as a Canadian, we're aware about 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, but I'm not sure how many of us are aware that the batteries that's being used in those EVs are actually extracted from Tibet. More than 85% of those lithiums are extracted from Tibet, which has record of strong human rights violations. So Adrian Zanes, who wrote the reports on forced labor in East Turkestan, wrote a report about forced labor in Tibet in 2021 for the Jamestown Foundation. Similarly, Reuters, as I mentioned in my opening remark, also reported about mass training, which included political indoctrination. And after about 6 weeks of training, those Tibetans were transferred to southern Tibet, closer toward India's border, and they were put into factories, construction sites. And we're not sure whether they were consulted or compensated during this transfer from the training to the those working sites. And hence, the UN Special Rapporteur used the term the possibility of forced labor. So we're seeing really a combination of abusive extractions of minerals and also a strong possibility of forced labor in what's happening in Tibet. So somehow I really wanted to take this opportunity to promote awareness about forced labor, but also about the abusive extractions of lithium in Tibet.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think as a complement to this, it would be interesting for this committee to look at some of the other issues in these same supply chains involving Chinese state-affiliated companies, including, and I'll mention it again, some of the issues in the DRC. But thank you for bringing our attention to the issues in Tibet, and I think the committee is likely familiar with the issues in East Turkestan as well. Just quickly, in the time I have left, Canada has obligations under the USMCA, and the United States has stopped far more shipments than we have. Do you think one step we could take in terms of improving our engagement with the United States would be to do more on the forced labor side? Do you think that would make a difference in our engagement with the United States? I see a few nods. So, but Ms. Kwan, do you want to comment on this quickly?
Yes, I think it's absolutely necessary for the government of Canada to act quickly on this. Because, like I said, I did not accidentally put that piece in my remarks. This discrepancy of numbers has actually raised a lot of loud concerns from many American politicians. It is an irritant, and luckily it's one of those issues that what's good for us is good for them at the same time. So I think it's absolutely a win-win situation in terms of going to the CUSMA renegotiation table with something in hand that says we will definitely do better, we can do better, and we'll prove it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Way over here.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Steve?
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you for being here, dear witnesses. This is a very important topic. I would like to understand some things here. I'm from the business world. I would like to talk about the supply chain, but before that, I hear about the number of shipments in Canada and in the USA. And we have been drawing the contrast between the two. But beyond the number of shipments seized, is that the only way to measure the effectiveness of it, or are there other more invisible ways that we cannot see? Because we talk about the number of shipments only, but are there other ways to measure the impact of these measures? And I ask this to all four of you.
It's a good question, and I think there's a number of factors that can be looked at. Obviously, I think intercepted shipments are one important measure of many. Others I think come back to this theme of rights holder engagement in part. they do come from rights holder groups. Like when we're talking about forced labor, we I think an important source there is reports from rights holder groups of forced labor from whistleblowers, etc., who are raising incidences of forced labor. So I think that's another one that I would add to the table, but among others, obviously.
Madame Kwan?
I would say that it's counting shipments that are stopped or withheld, and then counting the ones denied because it's been proven, or there's no objection to being determined as goods from forced labor. That is one metric. It is a metric that is in a way, despite the fact that it doesn't really work very well right now in Canada, but it is a metric that is very solid, right? I would say that if you want to look at more metrics, I go back to a holistic approach, right? Because the transparency legislation we have right now, the former S211, it requires a company to report. I mean, quite frankly, if you ask me to report on something on my name tag, I can write you a report on that, right? So it's meaningless if you're not compelling them to identify and then act. And that's where I think the difference is. You can report on anything, but if you actually are compelled to act, then you actually have to identify what exactly you're acting on, which is, I think, a metric that would be useful. Quite frankly, I think that, I've said this before last year in this committee, we need to build, as our PM would say, we need to build, but we also need to build in a very forward-looking way. Where are we going with this stuff? And where we're going with this stuff is trade that is different than what we had before, which we know doesn't work. We are regressing back to a very old traditional model that doesn't work, which is why we were in the mess that we were during the pandemic. If you remember the panic about, the vulnerabilities in the supply chain. So all to say is that, we need to do more, and we need to do things which are, hopefully more comprehensive in approach.
Puis on parlait de la chaîne d'approvisionnement rapide.
Quickly, on the topic of supply chains, can you give us one or two examples of standard operating procedures of how this infiltrates into the supply chains and how it becomes invisible? As I said, in my past experience, this is something that's not often discussed. Is there some sort of MO? Do you have concrete examples?
I understand the question. I mean, there's it's dog eat dog, right? I mean, in terms of competition. And so there is obviously going to be, you want to bring costs down, you bring in the cheapest materials, and oftentimes you don't care, right? Or you don't spend the time to see where your materials are coming from. A lot of forced labor and supply chains goes completely unnoticed by the people doing the trading, the ultimate, producers of the final goods. And so this is a very complicated process. It involves way more companies than, shipments are being stopped at the border, even in the U.S., and it's a big can of worms. I mean, we're talking about competition with China on goods that do require a lot of this stuff that is very dirty to get out of the ground, very labor intensive, and huge competition. And the pressure to find those cost savings is enormous. And so, yeah, like Elizabeth said, if we're doing things in the standard free market, let's just bring in the cheapest goods possible, it's just not going to work. And we're going to simply reproduce the problems that China is experiencing with forced labor in its electric vehicle supply chains, for example, through, building new mines elsewhere, for example, and just reproducing. There's a certain low cost involved that makes those cars cheap, that if we're going to compete on the same free market ways, we're going to end up reproducing these problems. And so this is important that we get this right in a comprehensive way. And that's where the monitoring by civil society and other groups and the repeated care from governments cooperating with each other is going to come into play.
Thank you very much. Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 2.5 minutes, please.
Écoutez,
As we have said, there are two sides. There is the products imported, and there's also what we have to require companies to do upstream. if we remember correctly, S211 only targeted businesses of a certain size and only called child labor. And they just had to produce a report. So now it's true that there were amendments, but you can just report that you did not implement any measures. What do you think a real due diligence law should look like? Can you provide the criteria of that?
Start on that question, and I think several very important criteria for an effective due diligence law. One being the obligation for prevention, and that I think is at the foundation of an effective due diligence law. It's that it's establishing the obligation to prevent harm by doing your due diligence, to examine your supply chain and identify any human rights, identify and remediate human rights abuses that you may find. Within that, I think an application to all human rights is very important. As we know, human rights are interdependent and indivisible, and the violation of one right often contributes to the violation of another right. A common example is that collective bargaining rights, if they are not respected, can be a risk for forced labor, for example. And then I think a third essential piece is access to remedy. Remedy, I think, is foundational to justice. And so the model law that CNCA has put forward is one where that access to remedy comes through by that private right of action in Canadian courts for rights holders who have experienced harm in Canadian supply chains. And I think that access to justice is a kind of a fundamental third element.
Le recours aux victimes, en effet, qui est un élément important.
So, on imports, there is a bill C-251. Currently, there is no legislation on due diligence. I suppose that you support something like that to be tabled. Do you think that the former bill C-262 was good enough? Any of you can answer. Just a quick yes/no is enough. And then maybe we can do something to remind us of what the law had.
I could start us off there, but yes, I think Bill C-262 was a strong law. It was based on the CNCA model legislation. It had those key elements, and so I do view that bill as a strong encapsulation of those key due diligence elements.
Juste par oui ou par non.
Wants to answer.
Yes. The answer is yes.
Mr. True?
Sure. I'll say yeah. Sure, yes.
Mr. Terchin? Yes. Mr. McKenzie, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I appreciate all of your presence here today and all the information you're providing. I'm a new member of Parliament, so I'm a little bit, I'm coming in the middle, or perhaps, I don't know where in this issue, but it's been ongoing for quite some time. I've been reading about the fall economic statement delivered by the current Liberal government in 2024, and a commitment at that time to create a due diligence regime. Do I understand correctly that has not happened?
No, nothing has happened because the fall economic statement did not go through, basically.
Okay. And similarly, at that same time, in that same document, there was a promise to create an oversight agency. Has that also been an empty promise to date?
Correct.
Okay. So if we had some of that mechanism, I mean, it seems to me that the legislative base is largely in place. It's just a question of follow-through, of action on the part of the government, so that we can actually see some of the intentions that I think our country holds. You've referred to civil society and the interests that we have in ensuring that our country is not benefiting from the derogation of rights of others in other parts of the world. So we've got the legislative framework. We had a promise that we would have effective enforcement, and it just hasn't come to pass. Is that fundamentally where we stand?
That's how things stand right now. And I would say the current C-251, the former C-262, and also whatever draft legislation was prepared to support, to prepare for the passing of the fall economic statement is somewhere out there. because, as you know, for instance, right now, the budget has a budget implementation bill. And so if the fall economic statement had gone through, that too would have an implementation bill. And in that implementation bill, the pieces of legislation drafted would be in there.
We would find those answers there, but would I understand then that you have not found those answers there in the budget documents that have just been tabled by the government?
I don't believe that civil society or unions have seen the draft.
Okay, you're waiting to see. So hope remains. Is that the word at the moment?
Well, I don't want to take up all the space, but hope remains, of course. But, quite frankly, survival remains too, because, the CUSMA renegotiation is coming up in 2026.
Indeed, indeed. New days ahead. My colleague, Mr. Mantle, referred to what I take to be the comparative effectiveness of the United States at interdicting shipments of goods that they've been able to identify as having been produced with forced labor or other labor practices in violation of international norms. We have not had that success. Should we be working more closely with the United States to try and benefit from some of their successes?
So, yeah, I think we should, and I think we should do it irrespective of the progress in the CUSMA negotiations. It's something we should get to right away with Mexico as well. The fact is the U.S. has a lot of resources, more resources than we do, obviously, a bigger country, and have been doing this longer. And we can probably learn quite a bit from them. Even in some of the information we collect and require of our importers, they do a much better job. And this is publicly collected. It's transparent in some cases. You can study it, right, as researchers. And so to figure out what they're doing that works and to harmonize to some extent, give that information to civil society, what's coming in from where. There's been some great investigations done, right, from the CNCA and others in terms of finding forced labor. So anything that can feed into that in a trinational perspective, I think would be great.
Thank you, Mr. True. We have the benefit of some of my colleagues from the House of Commons here who are part of the government caucus, and I'm sure they'll take that information away. I want to ask, and it's open for any of you to respond to, whether you have concern about what I'm going to characterize as a warming in the trade relationship between Canada and the U.S., Canada and China. Does that give you pause for concern?
So I would like to make it clear that we at the Canada-Tibet Committee is not against the trade relationship between Canada and China. What we're concerned is that any import of goods product coming out from China should be in accordance with the international norms of human rights. And so that's something that I think if we had a legislation that would verify not only the current stages of the product coming in, but also, as a member mentioned in the past, upstream, where it really originates from, I think we would have by now known that the batteries being used in those Chinese EVs were extracted from Tibet. But despite a lot of media attention on the 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, we still don't know much. Many of us don't know that those batteries could have been used from Tibet.
Thank you very much. Other concerns as that relationship changes? Oh, pardon me, Madam Chair.
It's okay. I give them an opportunity to answer for you quickly if you like.
I'll go. I wouldn't say, in characterizing them as getting warmer, I would say maybe a little less frosty would be the way I put it. No, like inherent across the board concerns with considering, taking steps toward closer engagement with China. I do have, I think, some concerns with, obviously, we're interested in an independent foreign policy, ones that are not beholden to China or beholden to the United States. And we have some concerns related to the CUSMA review and renegotiation, questions around how much, are there going to be other poison pills, so to speak, in that renegotiation that stop us from those kinds of conversations we might have? Responsible conversations. We don't want to go in naive or anything in terms of getting closer with China. But do we want to, for example, mirror U.S. trade remedies, harmonize U.S. trade remedies as an impulse. I'm not sure. I think these are going to come up, and we're going to have to think about them.
Mr. Navdi, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today. Every time we are having a conversation like this, where this is not a topic of conversation that's just relevant to Canada, but concerns around the world, I'm always curious to know what are some best practices are and best models are around the world. So if you could all probably take some time to express which jurisdictions in the world you think we should be looking at in terms of laws, regulations that you feel got it right when it comes to forced labor, when it comes to making sure the supply chains, there's appropriate due diligence in relation to supply chains. Maybe we'll start with Mr. True.
If it's all right, I'll defer to my colleagues on that, who've done much more research on the comparative, international comparisons. Yeah.
I think it's worthwhile looking at the EU model, although last week they weakened it. But that weakening, I think, as many things that are happening around the world, has to do with the politics that is prevalent right now in each country. But I think that's one of the areas that we should look at. And indeed, I also think that it's important for us to line ourselves up more with the EU if we want to do more trade with the EU.
I think the EU does offer a strong model, and echoing that it is unfortunate that we have seen some weakening due to specific political dynamics. And I note as well that there have been a number of public statements, including from large business groups in the EU, speaking out against that weakening. I think another example that could be named in terms of jurisdictions that are moving forward with comprehensive due diligence regimes for the human rights obligations of their companies. South Korea is a country where legislation has been tabled this year. We obviously see examples of existing legislation in France or in Germany, for example, as well. And I think it is worth saying that there is kind of a growing global push towards stronger regulations across the board, and I think it is important that Canada not get lost and is part of that, taking a leading role among those leading states that are starting to adopt these stronger measures.
Mr. Turch, do you have anything to add?
I think I suggested in my recommendation about working not only with the U.S. but the G7 partners. So I'll just leave it there.
Can I just pick up on the question, the response that you gave? Both of you reference EU. Mr. Gilchrist Blackwood, you talked a bit about South Korea, France, and Germany. What elements in those legislation that makes it robust or strong in your view?
I mean, I think a key element is of all of those laws is the strong due diligence obligations. So it's establishing under law that corporate obligation to do your due diligence to prevent harm. And so I think that prevention piece is really key. I mean, that all of this legislation I think has really put that expectation into practice. And as we've been discussing throughout this hearing, ensuring that prevention is a key part of the comprehensive measures that we're looking at, I think is really essential.
So the idea is to really put the onus on the businesses, on the companies who are producing things or maybe purchasing things from other jurisdictions where there may be concerns around forced labor, to do the appropriate due diligence. Is there something similar to what sort of we see around corruption as well, around bribery and corruption, those type of regimes?
I think that I think there are some analogous elements. Certainly, I think we've seen. I think there's some like it's not identical, but I think that there is some parallel to be drawn there. Certainly.
I want to come to the topic of remedies. I think Mr. Gilchrist Blackwood, you spoke to remedies. Again, can you speak to what kind of remedies do you have in mind or recommendations for this committee when it comes to companies or businesses not following through that due diligence that you're speaking of?
So it will often be context specific. So again, in the case of when we're looking at comprehensive due diligence legislation, oftentimes that a remedy mechanism oftentimes is judicial remedy. When we talk about import bans, I think a key piece that often comes through is the importance of ensuring that as part of as part of the that when a ban is lifted, for example, that as part of the a condition for the lifting of the ban, that there is remediation for workers, for example. In some cases, that has looked like payment of unpaid wages. So again, it can be context specific depending on the harm that we're looking at. But it is, I think, a fundamental kind of grounding principle in these different proposals that we're looking at.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Mantle, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In all of your testimony, you've talked about new laws that we need. And I have to say I'm not convinced. And I'll tell you why I'm not convinced. Because in 2020, we brought in an import ban. And we thought, all right, we have an import ban. That is the most heavy-handed law we can bring in. We're going to prohibit goods from entering the country that are produced by forced labor. Then we brought in a transparency law, and we said we're going to make companies report on what they're doing in their supply chain. None of those things have worked. You know why they don't work? Because the government doesn't do anything with it. So we can change the law as many times as you like, but if the CBSA and the government doesn't enforce them, you don't get any results. And we talk about why the U.S. is better than us at this. It's because they actually stop shipments and look at them. So I want you to try and convince me here that we don't have enough tools. And instead, actually, the problem is not, we don't need more law. We don't need a change in law. We just need the CBSA and the government on the other side of this table to use what they already have. You know, it's illegal under the Customs Act to possess goods that are illegally imported. So that means if car company X has got a car on its lot right now that has a battery in it that has 1 iota in its battery system that was produced by forced labor, because remember, this import ban has no de minimis provision. So if you've got one screw, I'm being extreme, but let's say you've got the battery in the whole car that's produced by forced labor, CBSA could go to that car lot and take it off right now. They don't do that. How about your suit that you're wearing, Mr. True? Do you know where that was made? No. I don't know where mine was made either. But if it has one fiber that came from a part of the certain parts of the world that we know is problematic for forced labor, that's a problem. So my point is, we have the tools, we have the agency, we seem to have no will to do anything with it. So convince me that changing the law or letting the government say, you know what, actually all we need to do is change the law and then everything will be hunky-dory again. Well, I'm not convinced. What I'd like to see is you guys say, actually we need the CBSA to do its job and enforce at the border.
I would agree with most of that. But as far as I understand, this legislative proposal, Bill C-251, is essential. It does provide an essential guidance to the government to fix a problem where, just as you say, we have the law, but it cannot be implemented. It can only be, it's a guidance versus then obligations and procedures. And as far as I know, and I've seen a legal opinion to this effect, which isn't yet public as far as I know, but I do encourage you to speak with others. I think you're going to be having more people here, and I would encourage you to talk to groups like Above Ground on this. And maybe others on this panel I know the answer too, better than I do, but it is essential, something like this. And I understand what you're saying, because it would be nice if we can just direct CBSA to go and do its job. Resources are obviously a problem, like you said. We need more people looking into this. Follow-up, I think, for the Canadian government in a number of respects is never good. It comes up in Auditor General reports in a number of areas, right? Environmental follow-up on labor standards, occupational health and safety. They're not good at following up on anything. So in this case, though, I do think that we need this specific piece of legislation in order to then start the process of forcing the government to do more than it is right now.
The CBSA can go back right now under their normal procedures 4 years into an importer's books, 6 years for some goods. They don't do that. So if we change the law tomorrow and said reverse onus, number one, the CBSA doesn't collect information about what region of a country it's from. Unless it's from the U.S., then they collect the state level information, but they don't know where in China a good comes from. They just know it came from China because the importer writes CH on the declaration. So they're not even equipped to do that. And even if they were, it doesn't stop importers from behaving badly, which we know that they do. You remember the number one question? One of the number one questions I got from importers on this when they thought, oh, you know, my goods might be stopped at the U.S. border. Could I send them to Canada instead? Because I know the CBSA won't look at them. That's the type of questions I got as a lawyer dealing with this. And so I don't think changing the law will do anything. I want to see the CBSA take some action first and then come back and say, we've actually tried to enforce the law we already have, and here are where the weaknesses of it, here are the loopholes in it, here are the things that are working, here are not working, before we say, you know what, changing the law again will solve the problem. Because if you don't enforce your reverse onus provision, you'll be back here saying it's not working again. Maybe I'll ask another question. Sorry, as you see, I'm engaged on this topic, but you know, I think it would be good to hear from the CBSA on this issue and from the minister. Do you think we should invite the minister and the CBSA officials to talk on this issue?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
If other witnesses want to comment, I'd be happy to hear on any of those issues.
I would say that we did make changes to the Customs Tariff Act because we wanted to sign CUSMA. That has proven as something that's not really workable. I think that when something is not workable, you either strengthen it or you bring in new legislation. Part of the things that have been identified is the lack of resources to actually do for the CBSA officers to do what they need to do. So this is part of the draft, sort of that when the government was going to introduce the draft, they actually put, first of all, they made someone in charge of this process, which is actually kind of shockingly important, but it is. They were going to put two parts together and make someone in the government, in GAC, responsible. Then they were going to strengthen the law so that they can actually enforce it. Then they were going to put resources behind it. So to your question, the fact is that they knew what couldn't work, and they were trying to address it. I would say that if you know something's not working, you know, walk away, do something new. This is something new, and you know, I think that it's worthwhile. You need resources to implement.
Just for your information, sorry, I let everything go. So this is extremely interesting to all of us here at the committee. CBSA is invited. Okay. So you'll have. CBSA has been invited. CBSA for now.
I suspect the committee would agree to invite the minister.
I don't think it's a problem. We will invite the minister, and subject to her availability, she'll be here. Okay.
His availability, public safety would be the responsible minister.
I think it's CBSA.
For CBSA.
Okay, the appropriate minister. Okay, we will make sure. Okay, Peter?
Chair, it'll be Monsieur Lavoie.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have many questions. I want to talk about the business side and their perspective. I heard many things about the burden of proof placed on businesses. I know many business owners, many of them. I don't know any who agree with that. I understand, Mr. True, when you said that there's the financial side, there's the competitiveness side. I understand all of that. But you also said that this is a big bucket of worms. It's challenging. You talked about big businesses and the onus of proof for them. But here's the reality in Canada. most businesses are small businesses. They are small players, and they do not have the same means as the big ones, and they are just as targeted as big businesses in all of this. So here's my question for all four of you. How can small businesses, because that's the majority in the region of Quebec alone, businesses with 1 to 8 employees make up 75% of businesses. So how can a small business do its part? I know there's talks about effectiveness and efficiency. Let's say they want to do so. They're ready to shoulder that burden. But how can they do it? Maybe you have mechanisms or hints or tricks. Can you share them? Any one of you can start. I'm talking about small businesses, not big businesses. They do not have the same means as large businesses.
I probably defer again to Aidan and Elizabeth on this. I mean, as the law would affect suppliers, my feeling is, yes, I agree. Small businesses are least able to monitor all of these things and keep track. Larger businesses may be in more of a position, but even large businesses would have trouble finding all of their suppliers for every sub-supplier and so on and so forth. As the system, though, is put in place, and you do end up with lists and you do end up with information coming in from affected the groups, right, affected workers and so on and so forth. Ideally, this is something that does fall on the supplier, the importer, but you would expect some cooperation from the government, I believe, in order to make this work. You can't just let it all be handled by people with not enough resources. But that's my take on this, but I don't know if...
I would say that I agree that, small businesses will find it very hard to actually kind of have the resources to do this, which is why, part of the regime has to be supports for businesses. Now, like, how small are we talking about, right? If we're talking about tiny, tiny small, then, well, maybe, we'll find another way of dealing with that. But if you look at what's happening in the EU right now, for instance, the weakening of the law has to do with the fact that they actually now have a base threshold that is so high that 52% of businesses in France are exempt from that regulation. So, again, you're talking about the small businesses, and I'm talking about, well, it really depends. The choice is up to the government to find that sweet spot of, how to actually prevent as much of the forced labor imports coming into Canada. It's so pervasive. It's not an easy task, but it is a task that is the way forward for a lot of countries that can see that this is good practice for both businesses as well as for labor.
I don't have too much to add to what's been said by my colleagues already. I agree absolutely with that there can be a need for very, very small businesses to have supports or to have special considerations in the case of very, very small businesses in particularly low risk sectors, for example, when it comes to this. And I think also just echoing that with perhaps an advantage as well of having an entity list, right, as you have a publicly available, and having that entity list be transparently communicated, is that you do that creates also a publicly available database of entities where there's suspicion of forced labor, which is also across the board something that would improve ease of business practices for businesses who are looking for that information.
Thank you very much. On to Ms. Ursula Tremblay for 2.5 minutes, and this will be the last speaker.
C'est bon, merci. Monsieur Terchin, alors que...
Mr. Terchin, we know that currently Canada-U.S. relationships are fairly complicated. Do you believe that C-251 can improve them? Because there will be an alignment of the North American legislative system when it comes to for imports.
I think I'll give a very generic answer. Although we are all, I think, concerned about the current trade relationship between Canada and U.S., but at a people-to-people level, at a cultural level, I think this is. I don't see this as a long-term problem. I see this more as a a temporary 1 year, 2 year problem. So I'm a bit more optimistic on this regard. In the long term, I think there will be a more favorable situation.
Oui, bien sûr, bien sûr. Ma question n'est pas de manière plus large sur les relations.
So, do you believe that this will send a message to the Americans, and we can tell Americans we have the same law, and Canada will not be filled with loopholes for products built from forced labor in China? So, do you think there's a geopolitical aspect to all this?
I think it definitely works in favor of both Canada and U.S. if we work as a team in countering forced labor import from China.
Merci. S'il me reste un petit peu de temps, dernière question.
Final question. Mr. Blackwood, you quickly brought up the question of the ombudsman. You said that there's currently no ombudsman. I assume you want someone to be appointed. Can you just say yes for the written record? Yes, absolutely. Beyond that, do you believe that they need more powers? For example, the right to ask for the production of documents or to invite witnesses? Yes, all of these. The office needs to be able to undertake effective investigations. Thank you.
Garnett has a burning question. I don't know if anyone else does. I'm just keeping track of the time. We have committee business to finalize on travel quickly, and we have to deal with Mr. Chambers' motion as well, and it's 3 minutes after 5. So, Mr. Garnett.
Thank you for your indulgence, Chair. I'll be brief. Madam Chair, you and I are both involved in IPAC, the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, international organization of legislators working on China that's done a lot on the forced labor issue in particular. I think it's noteworthy that one of the founders of that organization was Marco Rubio, who's now the U.S. Secretary of State, and also played a central role in the passage of the bipartisan Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the United States. He clearly is deeply personally invested in these issues. And it seems to me just like an easy area of potentially pursuing a win-win is to engage more with the United States on finding greater area levels of alignment on combating forced labor, working together on enforcement as well as on alignment in terms of legislation. Do any of our witnesses know if there's any conversations or proposals that have been put forward or discussed around, in the context of the present difficulties, around working more effectively with the United States on forced labor issues as a way to achieve a win-win on something that's clearly important to people within the administration and that's important to us as well?
I'm not aware of any conversations happening with the United States or the details of them. Obviously, the government hasn't shared a lot of those details, so we just don't know the extent of the proposals that have been put forward. I do suspect that the United States Trade Representative and the government would be very open to that kind of proposal from Canada to cooperate more closely on these issues.
Would absolutely agree with that, and I think that it's not something that people think of when they talk about the trade between the two countries. But like you said, it's a win-win, and we should absolutely count on you to amplify this with your colleagues in the House.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry. Yeah, just
if
on-
none of the witnesses have anything else to add, thank you very much.
For them to complete their answer.
Okay.
I don't have anything to add. I don't have any information on any additional information on the subject, but I also suspect that there would be openness there.
Peter?
Just following up on Garnett's question, just so what approach would you recommend so that the government would take on an initiative like this with Secretary Rubio?
I would hope that Team Canada out there, the key ministers, Ambassador Hillman, would hear about this and kind of, see this as basically a good bridge to the tensions that exist right now, because it is a win-win situation. They want it. They've wanted it in both administrations. And, we have now something that we can put together and offer them.
this is obvious, I think an obvious point to the committee, but I'd also point out that they may want that, but they also want to destroy our auto industry and destroy our steel industry. And so in terms of how impressed they would be by a proposal like that, I just don't know. It sounds to me like we're heading towards some agreement, some basic level of tariff that no matter what it is going to undermine our industrial policy, our industrial sector. So these are difficult questions. So just to say that, eagerly cooperating with the United States, I think on this issue, though, is very positive. So even outside of the trade negotiations, it might even be better to remove this as a CUSMA issue and to focus on this as something that's good for workers around the world and good for business in Canada.
Answers on it, so thank you so very much. We had you for an hour and a half, and we very much appreciate it. We normally don't have that much time with our witnesses, so this was exceptional today. So thank you all very much. While the witnesses can leave, I will suspend. We'll go into committee business quickly, and then we'll go in and deal with Mr. Chambers' motion, okay?